Each house in Baltimore and books this week when it comes to the Baltimore Ravens, their wide receiver situation, the start of free agency, the pre-tampering, the real tampering, then the signing, and then, of course, this is where Peter Angelos gets involved in the Ravens, the ever-popular flunk the physical that we had going on here last week in regard to Ryan Grant. Lo and behold, Michael Crabtree is a Baltimore Raven. Luke Jones is here to recap what will... I guess once the season starts, once the next 2 or 3 seasons get going, we'll always be monitoring Ryan Grant, and certainly here we're going to be monitoring Michael Crabtree, and with much comes great expectations for Michael Crabtree at 31, correct, Lucas?
Yeah, and it's funny when you look at this start to free agency for the Ravens, as bizarre as it gets. I mean, I don't want to say the most bizarre start to free agency in franchise history, but it's got to be right up there from the fact that they signed a wide receiver like Ryan Grant. I mean, the kind of deal that typically you see other teams make, and you scratch your head and you laugh at them and say, what was that? I mean, who is this guy?
Yeah, how did they give Ricky Wagner that much money? The Bucs gave Ryan Jensen what?
Right. I mean, you just look at some of these deals, and here the Ravens gave one of those out, and however, wherever you fall on the scale of skepticism, whether you think the Ravens had buyer's remorse, whether it was merely a case of, wow, we really like this guy, but I don't know if we like him this much if we're really skeptical about his ankle, whether you think Michael Crabtree becoming available had something to do with that. However skeptical you want to be, the Ravens end up falling back to, let's face it, a pretty familiar old habit of taking on that wide receiver that's right around 30 or on the wrong side of 30 and cast aside by his former team. We've seen the Ravens do that a few times. Now, it's worked out really, really well for the likes of Derek Mason and Anquan Bolden and Steve Smith, and it's worked out not so well with T.J. Houshmandzadeh, Lee Evans, and certainly most recently Jeremy Maclin. So we'll see where Michael Crabtree falls on that scale, coming off of a season that wasn't all that impressive statistically, and certainly you look at that Oakland offense that was pretty bad across the board after being so impressive the year before. But one thing you do look at and take some solace, take some satisfaction, and have some optimism. Even though he only had 618 receiving yards, still had 8 touchdowns. This is a guy that gives the Ravens more of a threat in the red zone than I think they've had in quite some time. So we'll see how it works out. Certainly, Ravens are giving him some real money. This isn't one of those Steve Smith cheaper deals. This is a 3-year deal worth $21 million, $11 million guaranteed, and he's going to have an opportunity to make a little bit more than that if he comes to Baltimore and balls out the way that he's played against them the last few years with some of the numbers he's put up.
Yeah, this is one of those ones where you sign the guy so he doesn't beat you up. But in regard to Crabtree, obviously top of market, right? Like, you have to pay top of market price. That's what last week is all about. You're always going to pay too much. If you would have told me a month ago this is what they were going to wind up doing, jettisoning, Maclin and Wallace and come back with Crabtree, I'd say, all right, well, it's probably as good as they're going to do. You know what I mean? I didn't really expect them to be involved in a Jordy Nelson type of deal or whatever. But, as far as guys you've heard of, when the season ended, when we said we've got to get better, if they would have said to me, well, they'll have Michael Crabtree by Easter, I'd say, well, all right, that's a start. That's a place, and let's see what they do in the draft or whatever. So as much as last week was a fiasco, and as much as you and I have not really at all checked off on how the Ravens offseason is kind of sort of gone, what the owner has said, what the coaches have said, what the fans are saying, the PSLs are getting sent out. I mean, it is a very unusual offseason in a lot of ways because I don't think we're just talking about the football team, Luke, although I know you and I talk about that a lot, but I know inside the building, it's not just about the football team. It's about everything else that goes on around the football team and the long-term goals of the organization, because right now, this is a crisis situation for them where they have all of these PSL monthly plan options out on the internet and wondering who's going to send their $1,500 or their $15,000 and who's not. And I think they need to do something sort of splashy to make people go to bed at night and say, well, I think we can win 9 or 10 games next year. I'll check off on Crabtree, much more so than I was going to check off on Ryan Grant, which smacked of desperation to me.
Yeah, I think the latter part's fair. I'm not sure how much Crabtree's moving the needle. More
well,
so
throw John Brown in there, too, because they did add him. So they added another guy that caught 80 balls at one point, right?
Yeah, I mean, John Brown is the kind of guy who has some upside. There's some ceiling there, but there's also a very low floor for John Brown. I mean, that could be a guy who plays 6 games this year.
He could be Danny Woodhead.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually a pretty accurate comparison, other than Woodhead being much older than John Brown. But, in the case of Crabtree, I think it is fair to point out, this, on paper anyway, looks similar to Jeremy Maclin. I think we have to be fair in acknowledging that. I mean, he's coming off of a down season. He is only a year removed from catching 89 balls for 1,000 yards, so it's not as though I don't think Crabtree can be really productive for them, but I think they need to do more. I don't think they can just look at Crabtree and John Brown and kind of say, well, we're in pretty good shape. We don't need to take a wide receiver that early. I still think they need to be looking to take not just one, but 2 wide receivers fairly early. Whether that means first round, whether that means second and fourth round, I don't know, but I don't think you can just sign off on this to the point where you say, okay, I think they're pretty much done at that position, because if John Brown's not on the field, and if Michael Crabtree ends up being closer to Jeremy Maclin than Anquan Bolden in Ravens wide receiver history, then this group's even worse than it was last year. So, I think it's a start. I'm cool with it. I think it can help them. I like the fact that Crabtree's caught 25 touchdowns over the last 3 years, in comparison to, I think, 32 total for Ravens wide receivers over the last 3 years. So it shows that he can be a physical presence for them in the red zone. I think he's going to help them a heck of a lot on third down. But at the same time, I don't have designs of him putting up a career-type season, as he's now age 30, going to be 31 in early September, and coming off of his worst statistical season since the year he was coming back from the Achilles in San Francisco. So it's a start, but like I said, I still think they have work to do, and I still think they need to make a couple more meaningful additions, whether that's another free agent or whether that's committing some real draft capital. This can't be a draft where you go in and you grab you grab a Tommy Streeter in the 6th round or an Aaron Millette in the 7th round and try to pass that off as a meaningful wide receiver addition. So I think, certainly fans feel better about this than Ryan Grant. I agree with that, but at the same time, the way Steve Bisciotti talked about making a, quote, splash, that I wouldn't say this is a big splash. This is more of a medium-sized splash, I'd say.
All right, John Brown. We didn't go through the ringer with him because I think we were all so, sort of flabbergasted at the Ryan Grant signing and the numbers that were involved. But as a tandem, as 2 guys to bring in, it's certainly not top of class. It's not Antonio Brown or whatever. But in the case of John Brown, he's an interesting guy because he's had these health issues. He has real health issues, in regard with the sickle cell trade. But, a guy, and I said he caught 80. He caught 65. I confused him in Crabtree. But right. 65 balls in barely 1,003.
Still 1,000 yards.
But 65 catches and 1,000 yards. The next year comes back with 40 catches. Last year was really about the injury for him, right? Only started 10 games, had a hammy issue, quadriceps issue, back, all that stuff. 27 years old. And, by the way, a 3rd-round draft pick that I think, when these signings happen in this organization, I have learned historically that when Ozzie goes after whomever it is, in that second wave, Michael Huff, any of those guys that were damaged goods elsewhere, Anquan Bolden, whatever, it's always a guy they liked in the draft because it's the same people, right? Ozzie, Eric, George, Joe, all those guys, they probably liked John Brown in the 4th or 5th round a couple of years ago. That's usually how this works. If they're going to go and get a guy, it's a guy they liked as a draft pick and said, well, he would have been here. Maybe we could have done more with him the last 4 years or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's typically the case, and I think that was the case with Ryan Grant as well. That's why they liked him so much, and probably the proximity played a role in that as well. But in the case of John Brown, you go to anyone who's watched the Arizona Cardinals over the last few years, and they would all tell you that John Brown is a guy that has a lot of potential. He's got a a really interesting skill set. I mean, he flies. He's really, really fast when he's healthy, when he's not having leg issues like he's had over the last 2 seasons. And he isn't solely a speed guy. They say he actually can run some other routes and, isn't that one-trick pony necessarily. A few years back, there was talk that John Brown was eventually going to be the heir apparent to be the number 1 taking over for Larry Fitzgerald. Now, no one said he was going to be a Hall of Famer or one of the greatest wide receivers of all time, but it does speak to how much they liked his potential. But with sickle cell trait, I know he was asked about it on Friday during the press conference in Owings Mills. He very much downplayed that being the biggest factor in his injuries, but a lot of people have opined, and I know even Bruce Arians, their former head coach, talked about it as recently as last summer as far as them trying to get their head around how to keep John Brown healthy and on the field with sickle cell trait being a reality as far as his health. So I think there's some various opinions as far as how much that trait specifically hinders him, whether it causes the injuries, whether it slows the healing. I've heard lots of different things out there. And look, I'm not a medical expert, so I'm not going to try to have some bold opinion about it. I just know that it's something very, very serious potentially. So I think in the case of John Brown, I think on a 1-year, $5 million contract, it's fine when you look at that compared to the deals that were out there, the deal that Ryan Grant got, for example, at least originally. I think you certainly can say, okay, that's fine. I don't know if I love the deal, but I'm okay with it. I think it certainly has some upside. I think there's some potential there. But at the same time, I'm not sure how comfortable I feel just penciling John Brown in to be your number 2 wide receiver, and that's that. I think I'd feel much better if the Ravens are in a position to, whether it's the first round, whether it's the second round, to have another wide receiver, whether it means bringing back Mike Wallace at a cheaper rate. And let's face it, the first few days of free agency, radio silence as far as hearing any reported interest in him. But if John Brown is someone who makes a splash and really emerges and shows that he can stay healthy and makes plays, I'm fine with him being the number 2 receiver then. I don't know if I like the idea of just saying, yeah, we think he's going to be our number 2 wide receiver when you look at the fact that he only played 10 games last year. He only caught 21 passes. That's where, in other words, if he's a plan A kind of guy, as far as your vision for your 2 starting wide receivers, I'm a little more uneasy about it. If he's your number 3 or your number 4 and there's some competition there, then I think that deal has the potential to really have some upside to it. But again, you have to acknowledge this is a deal that could end up being a waste of $5 million, just when you look at the reality of where he's been physically the last couple of years. But anyone who watched him play in Arizona is certainly a capable player if he's 100% healthy, which that's the $5 million question right now.
Luke Jones opining on all things Chris Tillman here over whether $5 million. Oh, I'm sorry. Wrong sport, right? Wrong team. I mean, if you're going to give me John Brown or Chris Tillman after watching Tillman throw it around in the spring, I might go with John Brown. I guess on the case of the Ravens, so much was made about the wide receiver position. So much was made they got to get better, they got to get better. We all know there's 3 ways, right? There's his first free agency, then there's the draft itself, then there's whatever Jeremy Maclin or Jordy Nelson pops out onto the, onto the freeway June 1st or whatever. And then, of course, there'll be August cuts as well. There'll be some Jordy Nelson getting cut after the second preseason game as well. So there's still more opportunity. But in the case of the Ravens, as far as the rest of the roster, the rest of the things they're trying to do, losing Ryan Jensen, which, look, you and I spent 2 months talking about this. We were talking about this at the Super Bowl 5 weeks ago out in Minnesota. We kind of expected somebody to do something really foolish, but the highest paid center in the game, that's kind of wow numbers for Ryan Jensen, that all of a sudden he's going to make more money than Dermontti Dawson ever made or something, right? Yeah, I mean, certainly I can't fault the Ravens for not wanting to pay Ryan Jensen what was a reported 4-year, $42 million contract with, I believe, $22 million guaranteed, according to Adam Schefter, as that deal broke on Friday night, at least a reported agreement. But you can certainly look at that and say way too much money for Ryan Jensen on 1 full season as a starter, and I wouldn't disagree. But at the same time, you got to replace him.
and that's still a hole that's opening up on your offensive line. And they also cut Austin Howard. So they have two question marks now on their offensive line. If we're assuming Marshall Yanda is going to be completely fine, and we're assuming Alex Lewis is going to be completely fine, we'll see about Nico Siragusa, who had a disastrous knee injury. I'm not sold that he's necessarily going to come in and be a starting caliber player for them this coming year. He's got a lot to prove physically, and missed his entire rookie season other than a handful of practices. So I think there's some question marks. I think they have some in-house candidates that they like. I think certainly at the center position, barring a radical change like moving Alex Lewis or moving Marshall Yanda to center, I think Matt Skura is the pretty logical in-house candidate. We'll see. I still have some concerns as far as whether he can anchor as strongly as Jensen could, because keep in mind, with Greg Roman's blocking schemes, they use a lot of guards pulling. And if you have that, you can't have a center who's losing ground up the middle, because you're going to gum all that up, and you're going to have guys tripping over each other, and you're just going to have run plays, some of these counters and some of these misdirections.
You're going to have Jeremy Zuda.
Yeah. I mean, it's just not going to work.
Or Gino Gradkowski, which was even worse because he was just so undersized.
Right. So I am uneasy there. Right tackle, we'll see. Whether they're going to put James Hurst there, which, in his limited opportunities at right tackle, it hasn't been as bad as him at left tackle, but still hasn't been very good there at all. I think ideally you'd like to keep him inside at guard. So if you do that, what does that mean? Does that mean Alex Lewis kicks out to right tackle? Does that mean they consider moving Alex Lewis to center, which I know that was something that John Harbaugh brought up last spring right around this time? Again, not saying that's a plan A per se, but you kind of look at when they signed Hurst, how's this going to work? Because they clearly thought Lewis was a starting caliber player, even though he's had some injuries the last 2 years. We know what Marshall Yanda is. That's a given. But someone's got to play center. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways they could go. I still think, at this point, especially with moving on from Austin Howard, I think right tackle is a very distinct possibility in the first round or two, if their guy falls to them. And that there isn't a ton of outside or offensive tackle depth, but that's certainly a position that you would say, if it's not a full-blown need, I think it's certainly a position that they could use some more depth and some upside, whether that means starting this year or whether that means moving into a starting role sooner than later. So I think as much as you look at what they've done at wide receiver, and I'm not 100% convinced that they've dramatically upgraded there, but they've changed that room, which was Ozzie Newsome's promise at the Combine. At the same time, there are some question marks on this offensive line again. So, that's the frustrating thing about when you finally have a player like Ryan Jensen develop and you can't keep him. And again, I'm not blaming them. No way I'd say to give him $22 million guaranteed.
Hey, but let me tell you what. When we bitch about the wide receivers around here and say Ozzie can't draft a wide receiver, we can't sign wide receivers, Flacco can't find wide receivers, then you look up and you say, oh, well, what would our team look like if Ricky Wagner were playing right tackle and Ryan Jensen were playing? I mean, they've graduated guys. It would look like a really expensive offensive line, right? Yeah. I mean, and they have graduated a number of these guys over the course of time, whether it's the Ben Grubbs, whether it's – I was watching late night on Sunday night, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but late night Sunday night, obviously the UMBC game, I was at Judas Priest down at Anthem, which is lovely, by the way. Next chance you get to see your Foo Fighters or whatever down there, go see them. And I had the late night 30-minute FX thing on, the Super Bowl, and I totally forgot Lawrence Guy was running around down there, chasing Nick Foles around on Super Bowl Sunday. And I'm thinking, oh, well, we don't mention that, but they just had a starting offensive lineman in the Super Bowl. He was good enough to go play for the Patriots. They wanted him. We didn't think much of him around here. And, I mean, not in that way. I mean, he was a starting player or whatever, but it was, we're going to lose him. Every year the Ravens lose these guys because they coach them up and somebody gives them stupid money like Ryan Jensen or Ricky Wagner, and then we got to go back and play with Matt Skura or, whoever the next guy is in line, the genius from Penn State that retired in August, whatever. And every year this is part of, the NFL, right? I mean, you lose good players. We just don't seem to be the team going out and flashing and signing. But when the offensive line is broken this year and we got a bunch of rookies running around or unproven guys, you'd say, well, Ozzie sucks. Well, either that or give your center $11 million. I don't think they're going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that you can say is perhaps they need to be a little more proactive in trying to keep some of these guys from a standpoint of if Ryan Jensen, and you saw how he played in training camp, and I'm talking if you're the Ravens, not necessarily media, because we didn't know how Ryan Jensen was going to fare, but if you liked what you saw in training camp and you really liked what you saw the first 3 or 4 games of the season, what's not to say that you don't try to get him signed at that point, which I will fully acknowledge. You might be taking a risk. You might be taking a risk that you're overpaying for someone who's kind of an unknown at that point, but I guarantee you, if you would have been able to get it done then, you wouldn't have been paying him 4 years, $42 million. And maybe you would have gotten him for a little bit cheaper. So that's one area, and you kind of look at what Howie Roseman did this past year in Philadelphia. I mean, he was able to sign a couple pending free agents before they hit the market, and that's kind of my one. And it's not a major knock. I just think it's something where some of these teams are able to re-sign some players before they hit the market, whereas the Ravens have had a number of these players hit the market and then they're gone. Now, to their credit, Brandon Williams hit the market, and remember, when he hit the market, everyone assumed he was going to be gone. They were able to keep him. Wasn't cheap, certainly, but I think that's maybe the one thing I would point to and say, maybe if you're a little more aggressive in trying to pay them before, and I'm not talking a week before free agency. It's way too late then, but maybe you try to pay them in September or October of their final year of their rookie contract. And some of those guys are going to balk and say no. I'm guessing Kelechi Osemele would have been a guy where no way because he was a starter from day one. But Ryan Jensen might have signed a very team-friendly deal back in early October. But once Pro Football Focus has given him the love, and there are lots of people starting to pay attention to him, and he's knocking over Kiko Alonso for concussing his quarterback and getting a lot of fanfare that way. At that point, Ryan Jensen becomes a name that teams are following. So, that's kind of my one little suggestion that I would make. Maybe they need to be a little more proactive, maybe a little bolder with trying to keep a couple of these guys before they get to this point, and then they're way too expensive. There's no question about that.
He is Luke Jones. He is Luke at WNST.net as well as Baltimore. Luke, all of our WNST programming brought to you by our friends at Howard Bank. A relentless commitment to be the best at everything they do. Now branches throughout Baltimore and Maryland. Also the sponsor of our Thursday Community Series here, which begins on April 5th, as well as with Cole Roofing. We all felt that March wind blowing in, and we got some precipitation going on this week. Don't let it goof on your roof. If you have a commercial roof space, you know how devastating it can be when things go bad on the roof. Get it checked out now before the rainy season comes. It's Cole Roofing at ColeRoofing.com, as well as Pfister Energy. We'll hear from Bill Cole later in the week. And I got to tell you about our friends at Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. I actually have my Royal Farms mug here that I'm holding on the YouTube WNSTV channel and our Facebook Live. Tasty coffee. Make sure you're downloading and using that app. Get the points. When you pump the gas, it's going to give you free Western fries, free fried chicken, as well as some of that Kona Blend coffee. Real fresh, real fast. It is Royal Farms. Reminder, head coach Barry Trotz of the Washington Capitals will be joining us next Thursday night, the 29th. We call that opening day around here, but it's going to be at 7:30 at Michael's Cafe in Timonium. Crab cakes, the split-level soup, the prime steaks, and the beautiful outdoor garden now, and rocks and fireplaces and Merlots coming into the spring and into the summer. We'll see you at York Road at Michael's Cafe. We're going to be telling you about Michael's all summer long. We are so excited to have the Dallas family as partners here for us. And we will see you on Thursday night, the 29th, with head coach Barry Trotz. Luke, for the Ravens, any expectation that this thing's going to settle down here a little bit over the next 5-6 weeks before we get ready for the draft? The draft's still a long way out. It does feel a long way. Yeah, I mean, we still have well over a month to go until the draft. So I think they still have some cap space where I think there's a possibility of them making another
decent move. I know some people have talked about Eric Ebron, the former tight end of the Detroit Lions, former first-round pick, and I know you and I even touched about him.
Another guy they loved in the draft. I always go back to that. That, you know, these guys, when they miss a guy in the draft, Ozzie and these guys say, 3-4 years from now, he might be available again. Going to cost more if he goes and plays, but maybe we'll get a John Brown. And I guess in their case, Ebron was one of those guys. Every tight end the Lions have ever drafted, they've liked somehow, some way. But, you know, in the Billick era around here, and even in the Harbaugh era, they've always loved tight ends. They drafted 2 of them one year, right?
Right, and that's still very much a need. As much as we spent a couple minutes talking about the offensive line, I mean, tight end, they need a pass catcher. They need someone that can be a threat inside the red zone. They need someone that can split the seam and make some catches and get downfield a little bit. Ben Watson kind of sort of did a little bit of that last year, but I think it was very clear, he just couldn't run the way that if you have a 27-year-old tight end rather than a 36-year-old or 37-year-old tight end. So I think that's a position that's still one of need, one that they need to address. And even though there are absolutely some tight ends in this draft, like Mike Gesicki from Penn State, who was very productive and absolutely had a massive combine from a testing standpoint, most of the time a tight end coming into the league as a rookie, you can't expect a whole lot of production. I mean, even go look at Rob Gronkowski's numbers his first year. He wasn't Gronk just yet, playing for the Patriots as a rookie. So I think they could stand to benefit from adding a veteran that can be a little more of a pass catcher. I think from a blocking standpoint, they're in pretty good shape. Nick Boyle certainly is a good blocking tight end. As much as Max Williams has been a massive disappointment as far as what his potential was supposed to be, he did a nice job for them blocking last year. Now, I don't think you can hang your hat on those two and say that they're in good shape at the position in general, but they have a couple guys who can block. They need a pass catcher. They need someone who can do that. So whether that ends up being Eric Ebron, who in some ways I like, but at the same time, look at his touchdown totals, and he's been an inconsistent player, and that's one reason why he's not in Detroit anymore. The Lions wanted him to be a stud when he was a top 10 pick. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think they certainly would like to add a veteran-type player that at least gives them some insurance, and then you'll see where the tight ends fall in the first few rounds of the draft. Tight ends similar to wide receiver in this draft, in that there isn't that slam dunk top 15, top 20 kind of a pick, but I think there's some intriguing talent for day 2, and I think the Ravens could certainly be interested in those types of players in rounds 2 and 3. So we'll see how that plays out, but Eric Ebron's kind of the name that's out there right now, but how much he commands, and certainly there's been interest from other teams in Ebron services, so we'll just have to see if the Ravens get their chance to make their pitch and see if they can get their man in a way that they made very clear Michael Crabtree was going to be their man, as they didn't let him leave Owings Mills without a contract.
He is Luke at WNST.net in Baltimore. Luke, he'll be with us all week. Of course, we had a crazy weekend with UMBC. The Ravens are settled down. We're a week and a couple of days out on opening day now. Yeah, it's after St. Patrick's Day. You're all hungover. All of our WNST programming. If you didn't get the King Liquors, get over there now. I mean, the shelves are empty. They cleaned them out on St. Patrick's Day weekend. Lottery, beer, booze, and the best prices in Baltimore. Get on over to Rosedale. Give our friends Paul King and all the King family a ring over there on Pulaski Highway. Also, brought to you by our friends at Freedmont Mortgage. Don't make a 30-year mistake by choosing the wrong lender. You need the right lender. You need Freedmont Mortgage. And, of course, they sponsor all of our live events. So, of course, we'll be swabbing for the Bone Marrow Registry along with head coach Barry Trotz of the Washington Capitals next Thursday night at Michael's in Timonium. It's all brought to you by Freedmont Mortgage. Maryland Jockey Club, the racing entries in the morning newspaper each and every morning, brought to you by Planet Fitness, as well as on the front of our WNST.net website. Maryland Jockey Club, Laurel, we're getting closer to Preakness and the Pink Day and all those good things as we're down at Laurel. I'm going to be going to the Kentucky Derby down to Laurel with my wife with a hat and a fantastic tie on that day, I think. Maybe I'll wear my bolo. I think I'm going to do that. Nasty at WNST.net finds me 24 hours a day. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live right here on our Facebook wearing my UMBC swag. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 at WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.